Welcome everyone who's joining us. We'll get started in just a few minutes as people are tuning in. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. Welcome and thank you for joining the Boston University Institute for Global Sustainability for today's Research for People and Planet webinar on bioenergy pathways. My name is Sean Elliott. I'll be serving as our moderator today. I'm a professor of chemistry at Boston University. I'm a member of IGS, but also a member of the molecular biology, cell biology, biochemistry program, and the materials science and engineering program, in addition to my affiliation with the Department of Chemistry. My work and expertise is in the area of chemistry associated with biological energy conversion, and I'm very excited to interact with our speakers today. Today's discussion is sponsored by Boston University's esteemed research partners at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL. IGS would also like to thank the BU College of Engineering and the Student-Run Energy and Sustainability Club for their support. We're delighted to welcome everyone who's joined us. So thank you for doing so. And we encourage you to visit IGS's brand new website at bu.edu/IGS for the Institute's expanded research on planetary and environmental health, climate governance, and energy systems to advance a sustainable and equitable future. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded and will also be available on IGS's website afterwards. So today, we have three fantastic panelists to share their expertise and thoughts about the future of bioenergy. They span academic and national lab research interests and industry, and I know that we're going to benefit from their varied perspectives. They are Dr. Jillian Goldfarb, the Associate Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies in Biological and Environmental Engineering at Cornell College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, Dr. Kimberly Samaha, the CEO of Born Global and BU College of Engineering alumna in electrical engineering, and Dr. Ling Tao, researcher in chemical engineering at National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Today's format is that each of the panelists will share a brief presentation, and we'll close our webinar with a more free-flowing set of conversation and questions. So for those of you that are joining us live in the audience, feel free to share your questions with today's speakers at any point using the Q&A button. You'll notice that in the webinar mode, the chat has been disabled, but you can certainly post questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. And so with that, we can now turn to our panelists. And first up for us is Dr. Jillian Goldfarb of Cornell University.
Hello, thank you, Sean, and thank you to the Institute for having me here today. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So I wanted to share some perspectives and a really quick research note for you today about corn catalysts and cooperation. Really, how are we going to travel this road together to sustainable biofuels? And one of the things that motivates me is what roles could biofuels and bioenergy play in addressing things like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? These 17 goals are the world's siren call to mitigate climate change, to lift collectively us out of poverty, and to protect the environment. And really, biofuels could touch on so many of these beyond just providing affordable and clean energy, and I hope to convince you of that. Now, biofuels aren't that weird for us, right? If you think about it, in the early 2000s, we had our first real shift as a country to biofuels when gasoline was required to then be 10% ethanol. And so this really convinced a lot of naysayers that said my truck isn't going to run on a bio-based fuel to, oh, this works. So in that sense, it was really positive. But something happened, and what we saw was that we had to grow a lot more corn to make corn-based ethanol. And that doesn't sound like the worst thing for farmers, of course, because prices went up, corn was in demand. But really the problem with increasing prices for corn as a feedstock is that as demand increases, the land to grow corn for energy became more valuable. So people switched from growing a food crop to an energy crop. And of course, because no one cares what an energy crop tastes like, we increased our fertilizer use to increase yields, which can jeopardize water bodies from the runoff of fertilizer. And of course, if we need more land to grow food, because we're offsetting that with energy crops, this led to deforestation in other areas. So Brazil started growing even more of our soy product during this time. And of course, that hastens climate change more. And then on the flip side, the human side here that we experience every day, corn became more expensive. So feed prices for animals increased, which led to food price increase, and of course, hunger increases throughout the board. So we had a positive in that we showed people that using biofuels was a reasonable thing to do, but we also created a problem with using kind of this first generation biofuel crop. So what did we really learn from this? Well, we learned that first generation energy crops are not sustainable feedstocks for fuel. So we have to transition away from energy crops to using things like waste for biofuel manufacturing. We did learn, however, on the plus side, that the public is willing to accept and adopt sustainable energy, at least in certain forms. And that we found that drop-in replacement fuels do have a chance to succeed widespread. And of course, that communities are willing to actually invest in clean technologies. And I think we've seen that a lot lately with the shift to electric vehicles and more charging stations. So we learned quite a bit, and these all align with these United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And the question is, well, where do we go? Well, if you've flown on a plane recently, you actually had a good chance of flying on a sustainable aviation fuel, but you didn't know it. However, sustainable aviation fuels as yet are not quite economically viable. They require a lot of credits for blending right now with actual fuels. And those credits increase the more greenhouse gas offsets you can provide. And this is really because we're at a technological crossroads, in my opinion. We have 9 different processes right now that are approved for sustainable aviation fuel production. And obviously the names of them and the exact mechanisms are a little bit more in depth than we need to go right now. But if you look at them, you see that the feedstocks for this can be rather constraining. And the other thing that you see a lot here are things like catalytic and hydroprocessing, Fischer-Tropsch. These are telling us about what has to happen to the biofuel once it's produced to make it an acceptable, sustainable aviation fuel. And I kind of see 3 major challenges to sustainable aviation fuel production right now, to go from where we're blending fuels in to where we can actually make enough biofuel to fly planes on them. And there are kind of 3 major groups. And I think you'll actually end up hearing about the first one a little bit more this morning, in that large amounts of fuel are required to do the testing. But of course, small producers and kind of proof of concept ideas require a processing plant to make enough fuels, but we require money to build processing plants. So there's a bit of a chicken and the egg problem. Feedstock handling is still somewhat of an issue. A lot of these feedstocks, biomass feedstocks, have dirt and debris or have too much water to be processed initially. So we have a lot of engineers working on how to handle that. And then where my group works a lot is really the cost of those upgrading, those catalytic mechanisms like the hydroprocessing. And this is expensive because we require things like catalysts to do this. And they tend to be precious metals, and they tend to kind of spend themselves out quickly. And the fun thing about getting to work in a university or a national lab setting is really we get to talk with a lot of interdisciplinary people. And I like to call this the chemist or chemical engineer mismatch. Where we are in a lot of the fundamental science with developing these catalysts that we need to make biofuels more economically viable is kind of a perfect example of academic perfection. Right? You see throughout the literature these incredible papers. This is an example from this past summer talking about how we can take lignin. So it's the most recalcitrant part of a biomass, and how we can take lignin and break it down and cleave it into useful chemicals for fuels. And this lovely paper went step by step and talked about all the chemical mechanisms And it's pristine data that just in the real world, if you look at the right side, this is some bio oil we made in our lab from avocado pits one day. You can see that the single molecule on the left-hand side with a catalyst and a mechanism doesn't exactly translate to the biofuel. So we have a mismatch between single substrates and what actually comes out of a biofuel process. And one of our colleagues, Dr. Andrew Sutton, kind of described this, I think, really well. We want to do renewable fuels, and biomass could be a viable source for renewable carbon to replace fossil fuels. But chemists tend to think in terms of functional groups and kind of that chemistry side on the smaller scale, one at a time. Whereas engineers like me think in terms of physical properties, and sometimes we don't care what the mechanism is. But the truth is we need to bring those approaches together, and that's what's holding us back a bit right now. But we think we found some common ground. All of us want to accomplish kind of the same things. We want to hydroprocess. We want to remove things like oxygen, tarry components to make a great aviation fuel. So we now start talking about how can we do this in a bulk way. And I think you probably heard all about the big data push in some of our science. And one of our hosts today, Professor Emily Ryan, and I work on this and talk about this a lot, where we have kind of a big data and a lab data mismatch. And I'm the lab data side. And people want to apply these machine learning models to discover these catalysts, but we don't have enough data to actually apply them because it's not big enough data. And of course, available literature is biased because we only publish what looks really good. We like to show off as academics. And while we have data sets for model compounds, of course, real biomasses don't follow those. So there's this misalignment going on. There's also a tendency, especially in academia, that we all have our own tool. My group does thermochemical processing, so heat and chemistry. And of course, we have our hammer and we always want to hit the same thing, but sometimes you need a wrench to do it. So not only do we have a kind of a field mismatch, we also have a data mismatch, and we have a tool mismatch. So one of the things that my group does is we look at, can we co-process biomasses with multiple steps, and trying to understand where is the optimal feed-in points. And just to show you, because I can't help myself with data, we actually, by manipulating the processes and the biomasses and things that are happening, we are actually able to tune the composition of these fuels by thinking a little bit more broadly and how to integrate our processes together. So kind of finishing up, what do we need, in my opinion, for this next generation sustainable fuels? Well, for sure, we need open sharing of data and better data sets. We need to align our approaches better. And of course, train our next generation of researchers to be able to talk each other's languages and kind of go beyond our own individual toolboxes. My students can't just use the hammer they have. They need to pick up computational hammers as well. So with that, I'll turn it back over to our next speaker.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Dr. Goldfarb. That's really interesting. And I think also very neatly encapsulates some of the multifaceted challenges that bioenergy faces, getting people to talk to each other and even think about what the sort of common language is, the common reference point will be as we develop strategies toward attaining sustainable aviation fuels in this case. I was curious, from your brief comments, what do you think the prospects are for kind of landing on what a model waste stream might be? I mean, one of the most attractive things about bioenergy is this idea of a circular economy. And so we sort of need to land on having scientists know, what should we be trying to use as our fuel source?
For sure. I think that's a great question. And I think all of us here would agree that there isn't one perfect source, and we need to be better about designing processes that are kind of spatially, so what biomass is available in a given region, and temporally and seasonally, so what's available at a given time, kind of flexible to those different things. So instead of working with just one biomass, we need to understand how the biomass's components interact and how they are processed differently at any given time. And that's part of what my group works on here.
Great. Thanks so much. So thank you, Dr. Goldfarb. We can now turn our attention to Dr. Kimberly Samaha. Dr. Samaha, I think you should be able to screen share.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Let me get that going. Okay. And then I just need to make this a full presentation. There we go. Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me. This is wonderful. And I think Dr. Goldfarb did a great job of kind of teeing up a lot of what I wanted to talk about, because I think that her points regarding collaboration and figuring out how to kind of design these projects so that those consequences that she showed at that first slide are understood up front and don't end up being kind of an unintended problem at the end of this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about an actual project that's located up in West Enfield, Maine. That's the slide that you see on the screen right now. We are in industry, and we have been buying biomass power plants in New England. We currently have 8 of them underneath our portfolio. This is a site up in West Enfield. A lot of these places actually were part of old industries. So they were connected in Maine in particular, and most of New England, to the paper and pulp manufacturing. So you can see the river there to your left. These were all kind of designed around supporting the waste that was coming off of these plants. So it does, again, hit on one of Dr. Goldfarb's points that, you know, first generation crops going into the woods and cutting down forests to make biofuels is obviously not what we're after. What we really need to be able to do is to first identify waste streams in which that can happen. So this particular one, if you can see, I think you can see my pointer here. You've got basically a biomass power plant that was existing there that is a very linear process. It takes wood, you know, that gets dropped off over in the lot, puts it through a boiler, we make steam, and the steam runs a turbine and we make power. It's about as old of a engineering. It goes back to when we first came up with electricity. There's nothing fun and new and technical about this at all. We have been working for the past 6 years, in particular with the DOE, to secure some DOE financing to install a large demonstration level biofuel project, which will be focusing primarily on aviation fuels. So we're working with one of the majors, which I'm not going to name names at this point until it becomes public knowledge. And that piece in the yellow that you're seeing there is where the siting of a large plant would be, including the ability now to integrate these into, I'm going to show you in a minute another slide about some of the things that you were just asking about, Sean, which was about, aren't we supposed to be kind of getting to a circularity around this? So the circularity elements of creating the processes around these sites is just as important, I think, as the outcome of the fuel. So we've kind of covered this concept that, one, we don't want to take primary crops and create fuel out of them. That's at the supply side end. But in the production of it, we also want to be very conscious of the byproducts and how those might be used. And then on the tail end of it, we want to understand that when we actually make the jet fuel, how is it getting to the jets? Because there's a lot of, in my mind, silly business that's still going on around, you know, having the financials drive those decisions. So in this particular case, we had to look at 3 different scenarios. You can see here in the middle, the railway that's coming into the site. That was the most obvious when we began, was to just basically take the fuel off the site by rail. We found out that, you know, we can get X dollars more in RINs if we're in California. So maybe we should actually rail all of this fuel to California, and it's cheaper if you bring it up through Canada, and it might be even better if you bring it over on a boat and bring it to Europe. And it just starts to make me scratch my head and wonder if we're getting X carbon offsets of getting this stuff into a plane, but we have to stick it in trains and boats and all of these diesel mechanisms to get them around the world in order to make the financials work. That really seems quite counterintuitive and counterproductive to the overall plan of things. So one of the things that we have been really working on this, and we're actually working now with Dr. Goldfarb and the lab there, is to analyze some of those slipstreams that come off of a plant like this, one of which is biochar. And I think one of the fun stories that we found in that collaboration was that there was a concern about using, I mean, I think some people on this call probably have heard of biochar. It's becoming a real poster child for regenerative agriculture and a lot of the different things that it can do. But because we work with a catalyst, there's a problem that biochar may be in some way contaminated and not being able to be used for crops. So we've already done a collaboration with Cornell to take a look at some of that, and to our surprise, some of the heavy metals that were showing up in the biochar were actually coming from a species of the tree, not from the catalyst. So that was a big aha, and that actually kind of doing that early level research, including the academia and going outside of the boxes that we normally would have gone to, created a whole other solution set that was maybe about, well, if we're going to be receiving the wood, is there a techno-economic analysis that should be done here that would show maybe we don't use wood that comes in with poplar trees in it. We use something else, and we're able to then monetize that slipstream of the biochar. So that's just one example of kind of how this would work. The other example that you see on this site, so you see the big biorefinery that's here. You see this is the power plant that's already in existence. This small little blue box down here in the bottom is actually a membrane technology for carbon capture. So capturing the CO2 and then being able to utilize, in the purple and the green here, it got cut off a little bit, but being able to use some of that CO2 in gaseous form. So also reducing cost and trying to find, I would say, food grade level carbon, CO2, which is quite expensive to produce. This is a cheaper solution that would give us a gaseous form of CO2 that could be fed into greenhouses. So having a co-location scheme where some of the CO2 gets recycled on site is one of the parts of this. And then also looking at bringing in recirculating aquaculture. There's quite a big movement towards that, where the CO2 as part of an innovation strategy can actually be fed to microbes that make proteins that a few companies are now trying to commercialize into fish feed. So you can see on this, if I get to the next slide, that what we're actually basically doing in terms of process here at the plant is that we're bringing in woody biomass, which is already a waste product. The biomass power plant, we could add another circle next to this and call it the biorefinery, because they'll be attached. The kind of streams that are coming off of that are going to be power. We've got heat that comes out of the plant that's fairly low grade. You've got things like fly ash and biochar that we talked about, and you've got the CO2 that comes off the emissions. So we are looking at processing these things into the second degree of those waste streams to say what else could be used. Obviously things like fly ash, but we've taken this piece of it even further and done some experiments with the University of Maine over the last year, where we're combining fly ash with biochar and creating green cements, essentially, using it as a substitute for cements. Part of what that has then led into is using, if we're going to be capturing those stack emissions and the heat that's coming off that stack, that this pathway, if you replaced fertilizer with green cement there, could also be drying. So again, it taps back into something that Dr. Goldfarb was bringing about the feedstock coming in. It has to be dried, it has to be cleaned. So there's another way of addressing that problem in terms of taking some of those factors into account right into the process of how we do this. So then just on the last slide, this one is a little bit more confusing because there's a lot of parts to this, but the idea is that if we start really looking at these facilities as energy parks, where you're going to be having kind of still the baseline of electricity, and there's a big opportunity here, obviously, because a lot of these older biomass power plants are now being shut down because we don't have paper and pulp, and a lot of the kind of industries that they relied on have gone away. So the biofuels creates actually new markets for in places like Maine and New England for forestry, which has been a big lifeline for a lot of these states. That's a big part of their economic base. And it also creates a lot of rural jobs. So a lot of what we talk about when we get into the details of the lab stuff that we do in creating biochemicals and stuff, that's all academia, high-end university levels work, working on greenhouses and aquaculture and concrete materials. And these are all rural jobs. So there's a piece of that that's really quite important there. So we still play in this world of commodities at this level. We sell electricity, we sell fuel, but then we can actually start getting into what you were talking about, Sean, which is the closed loop economics. As we start to go down to that next level, the additional slipstreams that come off of these facilities can be used in food production. So again, I'm just addressing, what happened with the ethanol. When I hear that, then we started to take away from the food production. In this case, we're actually creating new food production by using these waste streams. And then that last little piece of it, one of, I think, the magical secret sauces in this that gets me very excited is that as you create those platforms, so if we put in the membrane technology and we're capturing CO2 for drying and doing very practical things on the site, I also have enough of that to start to bring in those startups that always get caught in that valley of death, which they can make enough fish protein in the lab, but they can't get the money to get a facility to build their first pilot site because they have to have a boiler and they have to have CO2. And guess what? We have all of that. So we can actually start to create a new model of VC where these companies can then come onto these benches and start to create the next level of things that we need. So with that, I'll stop and pass it back to you.
Great, thanks so much. That was a wonderful overview, and again, showing this sort of sense of interconnectivity of all the different components that will be hopefully part of a bioenergy future. I do have just one quick sort of factual question. You mentioned biochar, that also came up before as one of the potential streams to focus on. What is biochar for those people that are unfamiliar?
Yeah, well, Dr. Goldfarb showed you kind of that list of the different ways of getting fuel. So if you're taking wood, basically in this case, or any kind of an ag waste, and you're taking out the oil of it, you're literally left with like a piece of char. So it can come in granular form. It depends on the technology. It can come out looking like a piece of charcoal. But it is actually something that they discovered its magic in the Amazon, where they were finding it to be this incredible absorptive material that can hold nutrients, it can hold water. I would call it a soil amendment, and certainly Dr. Goldfarb could speak to this better than I in terms of its characterizations, but it's been used now in all sorts of different things. So when you're thinking about, again, all that runoff of fertilizers, if farmers are using biochar, it not only holds it in place, think of it like a sponge, it not only holds it in place, but it actually allows us to use less of those kind of things. They've used it in animal feed now, where they're actually finding that can reduce gas in cows, so you have less methane emissions. Right. So it's got a huge amount of promise in lots of different areas, but there's, again, that commercialization problem. You're going to have to probably kill some shrimp, feeding them, new CO2 fish feed. And, those kind of things can take years, and we just don't have years. So we're trying to figure out shortcuts for that. Great.
Thank you so much. All right. And now I'll invite our last panelist, Dr. Ling Tao. You should be able to turn on your video and unmute and share your screen. Oh, it looks like you are. Wonderful.
Sorry, I couldn't find the button to open up my video. Oh, it's right here. All right. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Ling. I'm a PhD in chemical engineering and I'm principal engineer. Have been with NREL, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, for over 14 years, with primary focus on strategic analysis, techno-economic analysis, process design, on carbon conversion pathway for fuels and chemicals. I'm also been serving as the bioenergy analysis platform lead, with the responsibility to facilitate all the analysis effort on bioenergy and carbon utilization. So in the first set of the slides, I'm going to give an overview of what we are doing. So over the last 20 years, NREL Bioenergy Analysis Platform has numerous core analysis capability, which is summarized in this chart. And you can see that we provide context and justification for decisions at all levels by establishing qualitative metrics, using this metric to track progress towards goals, and also informing portfolio planning and management. So I'm going to go around the clock, just briefly introduce each of the core part of the capability. So starting with the strategic analysis support, and this is actually support various platforms for cost reduction effort, and also bridge R&D and offices. We're serving majority to DOE, Department of Energy offices. We perform analysis on sustainable aviation fuel, marine, bioproducts, biochemicals, refinery integration, also primarily support for cross-cutting analysis. For the resource analysis, we have extensive experiences and expertise on resource analysis capability, including all kinds of carbon-based resources. For the supply chain analysis, we have done a significant amount of work related to technology investment, market penetration. And we have a pretty famous tool called biomass scenario analysis model, which has been developed for 14 years and contributed to multiple technical perspectives, such as jet fuel, waste to energy. And those capabilities allow users to establish scenarios to support decision-making, highlighting interaction across systems or across supply chain. And this is actually a dynamic simulation. So using those, we will be able to understand market penetration, policy impacts, historical dependence, and evolving of the markets. And social economic analysis is actually one of part of the tool to support advanced understanding with respect to the potential economic benefit to local, state, and regional economy, and which could result from the construction, expansion, or operation of biorefinery using locally available feedstock and locally available workforce. And lastly is the sustainability. So NREL sustainability analysis team include analysis beyond typical full life cycle assessment. We have tools and expertise in both macro and micro level economic perspectives integrated with a conventional LCA, also using input-output modeling framework to quantify the net effects of expanding US bioeconomy. And then we believe NREL is the only national lab performing this type of analysis. So if you're interested in any of these core analysis capability, please feel free to reach out to me for detail or collaboration potential. All right, okay. Transportation occurs a significant fractions of US greenhouse gas emission or GHG emission, roughly about 30% of total US GHG emission counted from the transportation sector. So when differentiate current transportation fuel use, medium to heavy duty vehicle, off-road, rail, marine, and aviation are considered as hard to decarbonize sector. Biofuel are part of the sustainable transportation fuel strategy to decarbonize the sector. And based on the joint billion-ton study, so the billion-ton study was performed back in 2016 from US Department of Energy and US Department of Agriculture. It's indicated there are about 1 billion dry ton per year of biomass can be grown or collected sustainably. So Department of Energy estimate that with this amount of biomass, we can convert those into roughly 50 to 60 billion gallons of advanced biofuel without impacting agricultural trade or current use of biomass. And in addition to those biomass resources and waste gaseous source, it's actually indicated in part of these graphics. That's indicating there are other potentials of carbon that we can use, like electron to molecule, those are type of technology for the big volume that we're expecting to make. So the conclusion is US biomass or other kind of carbon can meet the needs of hard to electrify modes, such as aviation, marine, and rail. So in line with those net zero GHG emission reduction by 2050, the aviation industry has also committed to net zero emission by 2050. So the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Grand Challenge is actually a joint effort of US government-wide approach to work with industry to reduce cost, enhance sustainability, and also expand production to achieve 3 billion gallon per year of domestic sustainable aviation fuel production by 2030, and also projected to have 100% projected aviation fuel use or 35 billion gallon of annual production by 2050. And I just want to throw one specific data. So in 2021, approximately 5 million gallon of sustainable aviation fuel were produced domestically. Going from 5 million to 3 billion gallon per year by 2030 is about a 600-fold increase that requires over 100% year-over-year growth in production to 2030. So there are basically 3 key things I want to mention for this grand challenge. So it is critical that this growth start immediately. Robust, federal support for commercially proven technology pathway is necessary to achieve this growth. And we all know that US airline companies, industry have already committed to work with the federal agencies, federal governments, and other stakeholders to make this 3 billion gallon per year of cost-effective sustainable aviation fuel. The second point I want to make is this will require significant research development, demonstration, and deployment on the next generation of feedstocks and conversion technology. It is critical that demonstration project prove technology and supply chain in this decade. If this level industry build out is to occur in the following 2 decades. The third point I want to make in line with the net zero GHG emission reduction by 2050. So basically this point. Certain level GHG emission reduction for fuel made in the sustainable aviation category would be needed to reach this fuel world grand challenge goal. So this is actually a pretty significant level that is currently ongoing. All right, I want to give you some kind of like understanding of what new capacities of aviation fuel coming online. So as shown in this slide, new aviation fuel capacity coming online pretty much on a daily basis. And the CAFE, the chart is taken from this committee, is actually tracking this more closely. So although this list is not a comprehensive one, you can see that roughly about 600 million gallon of sustainable fuel production capacity coming online in 2022, and it will be expanded to 2.6 billion in 2026. And again, our goal is to make 3 billion just for aviation fuel in 2030. So these commercial activity provide steady pace to get us to the 2030 production especially for the aviation sector. Starch and sugar-based feedstock are emerging as potential near-term feedstock for aviation fuel production through like alcohol to jet and Fischer-Tropsch conversion pathways. And those are feedstock coming from, lignocellulosic feedstock from, MSW, woody biomass, forest residue, agricultural residue. And those are all studied in the billion-ton study I mentioned in the previous slide. Here, however, lipids are openly believed to be the feedstock to produce sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel, which will make up the vast majority of the feedstock to meet the first target, the 3 billion by 2030. So conclusion is that it's based on the analysis announced on some of the commercial projects, and the slides are showing the previous one, and it's indicating we should have sufficient amount of oil or waste oil-based feedstock. As shown in here, we have about 6 million ton of fog. That means fat oil and grease, and also about 12. I think USD has estimated 12 billion pounds of soybean oil that will go to biofuel production for 2023. And lastly, and there's another type of oil. This is corn distillate oil. Is about 2 million tons. One refineries integration is another important strategy to decarbonize aviation industry. As you know, all fuel used today, and especially sustainable aviation fuel produced in the future, will use some sort of hydrotreating and finishing. There are about up to almost 100 billion gallon per year distillate hydrotreating capacity available in the existing US refinery. And these capacity can already exist in refinery, and the rough cost of those hydrotreating capability is about 10 billion. And so leveraging this capability may save significant capital cost for biofuel deployment and may allow incremental transition to renewables by blending renewable and fossil stream. And the other benefit is a potential opportunity where re-permitting may not be required. Biomass being co-processed into petroleum refinery is now happening. The first material to be co-processed, the lipids, basically fogs that I mentioned. And these feedstock goes to hydrotreating units that primarily feed distillate streams. And there are a lot of significant R&D fundings related to how to use and how to co-processing this type of fuel. Renewable stream, however, in general are very diverse. So the challenge is what R&D or research and development is needed to harmonize the diverse feed so that they could allow for processing by existing refinery, existing hydrotreater. The other challenge is to invest if the technology can be extended to sustainable aviation fuel. If the co-processed feed could meet the tight specification to certify jet fuel. So there are a lot of opportunity to use existing refinery, and there are a lot of R&D will still be needed for this area. All right, so this slide, closing to the end, is providing a quick summary of what we have discussed. There still with a lot of important strategy to decarb aviation or even transportation industry. We need biomass feedstock. We need a lot of fast tracking technology. We need to also take advantage of existing infrastructures and existing pipeline. So this summarized the key takeaway. I just want to emphasize biomass can play a significant role in decarbonizing several sectors of the economy, not just transportation, but also going beyond of renewable chemical. So continued investment in technology, R&D, and scale-up demonstration are needed to ensure across all feedstock in all regions to meet the decarbonization goal, the net zero carbon goal. A near-term deployment is actually driven by strong market pull, and strong sustained policy are absolutely necessary to accelerate investments. So with that, I'll be happy to hand the floor back to Sean.
Great, thank you so much. I think for the sake of time, we're coming up to sort of the 45-minute mark. So I'm happy to segue into our sort of discussion portion of the webinar, which hopefully we can just think of as a sort of ongoing conversation. So if our panelists will keep their cameras on, and we can change the Zoom room to just be more of a collection of floating heads. We do have some questions already in the Q&A, and if people are listening live, would like to drop in additional questions, we'll try to get to them in some form in the next 15 minutes or so. So maybe I could just start with a sort of a very general question to throw out to all of our panelists, which is, intriguingly, we all landed somewhat on thinking about aviation fuels to some extent, if not entirely. And I was curious if you could, share your thoughts about, is that the model problem of thinking about bioenergy because it is so hard, or are there other drivers for why that does seem to be a clear place for people societally to think about bioenergy's contribution to sustainability in the future?
So Sean, I think that's a really good question, and I'll jump in. So we actually don't do sustainable aviation fuels, exclusively. We work more on the front end to figure out what molecules we could get out, what they could be useful for. But one of the things that I've seen in our field over the past kind of 2-3 years is really thinking about how, if we're going to shift our transportation fleet to a fairly substantial electrification side, which we can debate at another time, if that's reasonable. And I'm not personally sure, but I think there is some promise here. When you think about the next big CO2 contributor in terms of moving people around, which is what we do, it really is aviation. We also work on processes for things like marine fuels for small point of use devices. But when you think about how we could make a global contribution, now that the world's moving again post-COVID, I think this is just one that hits a lot of us.
Great. We have some additional questions from the chat. One really gets to the heart of sort of current industry-wide price indexing. And so the question is basically, is there an industry index for biofeedstock pricing with the specific interests in fogs and brown grease? But is that something that is there a norm nationally, regionally? Is that something that maybe Dr. Tao, you could speak to this when the analysis is going through at the level of costs? How is there a standard that we can use?
Yeah, that's a great question. Probably not a standard to use, but we have, I think the national lab system has done a pretty tremendous or very significant amount of effort to tune the feedstock costs. Biomass feedstock, like those lignocellulosic, for instance, forest, agriculture, those type of residue, the feedstock costs are driven by the collection, transportation, as well as other logistic aspects related cost. So it actually depends on how sustainable you want to take the biomass. If you want to take the biomass out of the field for a certain, radius, and the cost will be different from the other. So if you are able to look into the billion ton study, you can see the cost. If you want to have, $60 per tons of feedstock, and whether the requirements you have to meet to get to the $60, or if you want to take $100 per ton biomass, and this might be more volume and more available feedstocks, but it's coming with a price. For fog, I think a lot of those actually competing with the existing market, like yellow grease has the existing market. So if you want to divert yellow grease, brown grease to biofuel, you have to compete from the market price side to get those feedstocks. So there are a lot of work, analysis related work, how to fine tune or how to make it more realistic. And also the other work that we would encourage people to do is more like how to distribute those feedstock, because feedstock is going to be a competing market for a lot of other things. So it's complicated, so difficult to get a standardized number.
Right. Undeniably, it is complicated. I think on that we can all agree. Another question from our submitted questions, is really focusing on the topic of a circular economy. Are the aspects of environmental research done by each of you, focused with circular economic outcomes in mind? or is that something that just happens along the way? Maybe Dr. Samaha, you might comment on that.
Sure, yeah. I think that was, I had put that as the title of my talk, and I didn't quite get to it, about the metrics. How are we measuring this? So, as if the measurement is we've replaced X amount of tons of jet fuel, for example, with biofuels now, that's, the tip of the iceberg. And so if that happens at such a cost to food systems and the stock, the actual feedstock that goes into it, then I'm not sure we're measuring the right thing. And I do believe that we really have to put in, we have to build that into the specifications of these projects, which isn't currently being done. Part of the methodology that we work with as part of we have a nonprofit educational foundation called Born Global, and we work on biomimicry as a scientific methodology. And within that methodology, the set of specifications are called life's principles, which are essentially a set of all operating conditions that all life on this planet needs to abide by, because that's how it functions. It's not a matter of an ethics, it's a matter of an actual, if you don't have these kind of things, the systems fall apart. So that was an interesting piece on this large project that we're working on. We actually, when we ran into this question about the biochar, the first reaction from the lawyers coming from this were, all right, we're not going to do anything for agriculture, let's burn this in the boiler. And, that's could easily be done, but you can imagine the consequences then of more CO2 going up and all of the benefits of this thing not getting back put into the land. So we went back to the table and said, what if we viewed this from the life's principle of being locally attuned and responsive? If that was our North Star on this project, how might we look at these waste streams differently? And it was a fundamental perspective shift where people started to say, well, maybe we can burn some of that biochar because we're going to have a lot of it, but maybe we should put some of this into research. We should put some of it into fields. We should do other things that are going to create local impact. So I think those are the kind of things, Sean, that we really need to start thinking about what are going to be the measurements of these projects. And build them right in at the beginning and say, it's about being resource efficient. It's about circularity, getting as close as we can to zero waste on the waste streams. It's about using waste to begin with. So those are the things now that I think would really make these projects stand up, and the ability to start to think a little bit smaller. When you're talking about circularity, it's really hard to do that when bigger is always better, because it's still, you can't get out of that extractive mentality when you have to keep building things to be bigger, bigger, bigger. So I think those would be my two inputs on that, about getting us more into other realms, circularity, biodiversity, there's lots, socioeconomic, all of those things should be part of that initial blueprint.
Great. Other thoughts on circularity?
I just want to add two more things. So one is the plastic upcycling, and that's actually a very good example for circular economy. And there are a lot of ongoing R&D with NREL that are working on plastic upcycling. And the other one is actually more on CO2. So there are a lot of efforts. You probably all know that on DAC, the direct air capture of CO2. I think my point of view is we might want to work on the lower hanging fruits first, like the carbon from the carbon direct sources, like the fossil energy combustion area, and those kind of like the CO2 sources. Maybe we can sequester that or convert those, and that's another angle to look for circular economy.
Great. Sort of taking along this idea, we actually have a question from the chat from Benjamin Cross, who asks, when will we start to see detailed life cycle economic and environmental impact analysis performed on our existing and proposed energy systems? I mean, is there a way to embed this in the sort of processes of how the things that we do societally?
I'm going to grab that one because that's a great
Okay.
question, and that's
I figured
something.
that was for you.
And we're working with BU right now on this, so it's relevant to the people that are hosting us. So yes, I think that the LCA life cycle analysis methodology is the best that we've got out there, and so why create something new when we can use what's already there? What's very interesting with LCA right now is that it basically gives us an opportunity to create carbon as a fiat, essentially, as an actual tradable, monetizable thing. That's already being done in the volunteer carbon markets. But again, it's about what you're measuring and then what are you giving for carbon credits for. So you can even take things like biodiversity and come up with a set of metrics that could be converted to carbon, and then use a life cycle analysis to give an equivalent to the impact that a project would have. So I have a lot of promise for this. We're actually working with some top professors over at the business school right now at BU to take a look at this, and something that we're calling a carbon maturation matrix, because, carbon is, that's just like I said, if you think of it like as if it's $1 or €1, it's a carbon. If we start thinking of it like that, that changes the equation so that it's not just counting literally CO2, but a lot of the impacts of these projects that could move us towards rewarding things like circularity, biodiversity, socioeconomic impact. So brilliant question, and we're on it with BU's help.
That's good to hear. Okay, we have just time for just maybe one more question. I'm going to throw one in that I'm very curious about, and this is something that I think all three of you mentioned in varying ways. And just thinking about what are the opportunities for improvement. And I'm, being a scientist, can't help but think about the specific science space, but I know that was sort of built into some of the calculations and the modeling that Dr. Tao presented. I mean, are there clear places where, as scientists, we should be trying to push and trying to bring additional ideas to bear on how to enhance the performance of catalysts of certain kinds or certain processes?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's actually a very difficult question. So in terms of improvement, I guess from a ChemE, I'm a chemical engineering background, right? So any of the conversion strategy, we look for high yield. Either high carbon conversion yield or high energy yield. And that's actually the fundamentals for all the processes before going into the deployment stage. I think it's critically important. The other thing is we're actually more looking for simplicity. So a lot of processes are too complicated. So you need a huge capital investment to get it to work. So that's something I think from the chemical engineering side is something we need to work on. And the last thing is more like on the high TRL technology. So we definitely need production concept to be commercially viable. And so to me, the volumetric goal I mentioned a couple of times in the presentation.
Great. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think to play off of that and to also answer I saw another question of Benjamin's in the chat as well, to the point of what's the life cycle and the LCA-TEA obviously, and how do we get companies to co-locate? And this is something we think about all the time here at Cornell, and have multiple groups working on together, and hopefully accepted soon. We have an example case study right now where New York State just enacted a food waste recycling law, where if you produce more than 2 tons per week of organic food waste and you're within 25 miles of a receiving facility, you have to now process this waste. You cannot dispose of it in a landfill. So something that we did as a kind of an idea for this is developed the laboratory work to show how you could convert mixtures of available food waste in New York State using GIS data. And then we're using an LCA-TEA model to kind of show the carbon offsets that you can get, and also the economic ability to site these plants within New York. and kind of came up with an idea that you could cite 6 of these around the state according to this new law, and then develop a tool that shows policymakers what levers you can turn to increase food waste conversion and increase energy yield and make it more attractive for entrepreneurs. So I think to say all that in one thing, I think what we need to push all this forward is really a convergence of experimental work and modeling work and policymaking and entrepreneurial activities all to come together to start talking the same language and to really like move things forward on the same page.
Great. I could not say it better, and I think that is a perfect time for us to wrap things up. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to our panelists for their insight. Thank you for the audience members for your questions. It's been a very wonderful opportunity for us to learn about the future of bioenergy. And also another round of thanks to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory for sponsoring today's discussion, and to the IGS's BU partners at the BU College of Engineering and the Energy and Sustainability Club. So please stay tuned for more webinars in this series. You can see in front of you, we have one coming up on December 2nd on weatherization, energy insecurity, and health disparities. And eventually you will find today's recording at bu.edu/IGS. So thank you and have a good day.